Hi, everyone. Welcome to a recording on an article that is definitely very near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons, written by Agger and colleagues. And you'll see that I am actually a co-author on this article as well. And so in this recording, just a little bit, I will kind of insert my own thoughts and experience about the writing process, at least a little bit. But of course, if you have any other questions related to that, don't hesitate to ask me. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in with the summary, where in the introduction of this systematic review, the first thing that I want to highlight, as I usually or often do in these summaries, is the overarching objective of this article, where in this article we sought to systematically examine how adolescent development researchers have studied Black girls and women and the research paradigms and the methods they have used to do so. So, in other words, similar to some other work that you all have read in this course so far, rather than conducting a new study where we went out and collected our own data from research participants, what we instead wanted to do in this study was to conduct what's called a systematic review, where we wanted to use systematic review as a tool to gather all of the studies that we could find in several select journals, which I'll talk more about a little bit later in the summary, to examine how adolescent development researchers who have published in these very high circulated adolescent development journals, how they have studied Black girls and women, along with the research paradigms and the methods that they have used to do so. We also provide in the introduction a lot of different key definitions, and I want to bring your attention particularly to how we defined race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as the different approaches that scholars have used to incorporate these constructs in research. Not only those definitions, but also the approaches that researchers have used to incorporate these constructs are a really important guiding force of the systematic review and how we later extracted information. But as usual, I'm getting ahead of myself. But also another kind of important detail that was covered within this section of these key definitions is a brief description or discussion about how these constructs of race, ethnicity, and gender, in particular, have been typically used in adolescent research. Another really important part of the introduction is that we distinguish between two different types of epistemologies. There we go. I knew I was going to stumble over that word. Where, in particular, we make the distinction between a positivist epistemology, which assumes that predictable reality exists and can be uncovered through the scientific process. So predictable reality exists and it is possible to uncover this reality by engaging in the scientific process. Another really important part or characteristic, I guess, that's associated with a positivist epistemology is that positivist epistemologies assume that human processes are universal in nature. So the different psychological constructs that we've talked about in class, for example, most recently identity development, if we adopt a positivist perspective, that means that we believe that the processes related to human development during adolescence, let's say, are universal in nature. They apply to everyone. I would argue, and I think that probably there's pretty strong evidence to support this, that much of the work that we cover in this course, or I should say instead, that most of the educational and developmental psychology literatures probably either implicitly or explicitly adopt a positivist epistemology or use that epistemology to guide their work. That might be an implicit or explicit adoption, and it might be on the researcher's part either a conscious set of beliefs or in some cases maybe subconscious. So a positivist epistemology is one type of thinking and kind of major set of beliefs that have really important implications for how research is conducted. In direct contrast to a positivist perspective, we also introduced a critical epistemology, which instead challenges mainstream psychology's support for what are often unjust and unsatisfying status quos. Another really important feature of a critical epistemology is that this way of thinking contends with issues of race and power and marginalities. And then the last kind of set of key definitions that I want to point out here that we distinguish between in this section is making a distinction between an asset and a deficit-based perspective, which is something that we've talked a fair amount about in this class, and we did so as well in the article. Another really important part of the introduction is we talk about the meaning and the importance of researcher positionality. What do we each as researchers bring to the table when we are conceptualizing all the way through kind of executing and disseminating research? Researcher positionality. What do we bring to the table? What are our lived experiences? And importantly, how do those lived experiences contribute to how we conduct the research? We also describe different methodologies and make connections about these methodologies to epistemological beliefs. So how do the methodologies that we select ultimately relate to, and how are they informed by our set of epistemological beliefs? I wonder how many times I can say that with like maybe stumbling a little bit or maybe not stumbling at all. I don't know. It's a hard word to say, but an important one. Then towards the end of the introduction, we talk about the need for the current research and the overarching questions that guide this work. So in terms of the need for the current research, there are a few things that I want to highlight from this section. First, we point out that there has been no existing systematic effort on this topic. There has been no previous attempt that we were aware of that attempted to synthesize the literature on Black girls and women, specifically published in adolescent development journals, with a goal of understanding how researchers have conducted this work in the past and what kind of methodological perspectives and epistemological viewpoints tend to guide this work. So there's been no existing systematic efforts on this topic. Importantly, we also point out that identity, which of course is directly connected to or subsumes the experience of racial and ethnic identity and gender identity. Identity is particularly salient during adolescence and emerging adulthood. We use this kind of key, well-documented point in the literature as a means to really convey the importance of addressing this gap in the literature, particularly during the adolescent years. The third and final point that we make in terms of the need for the current research is we talk about how there are current norms in the field that may risk perpetuating white supremacy and normalizing and amplifying structural racism. And we point out that the systematic review that we sought to conduct in this work would provide a lot of insight into whether and how and to what extent the current norms in the field are potentially perpetuating white supremacy and actually normalizing, and rather than combating, instead amplifying structural racism. So those were kind of the three major points that we made in terms of the need for the current research. One, there's no effort like it on this topic. Two, identity is particularly salient during the adolescent and emerging adult years. And three, the current norms in the field might put us at risk for perpetuating and actually amplifying structural racism rather than combating it. And the systematic review would yield a lot of insight into whether and to what extent and how this is happening. In terms of the present research, it was guided by three overarching questions. The first question that guided our work was how do researchers approach and operationalize race and intersectionality in adolescent research. Second, we explored how research paradigms and or a researcher's epistemology inform the study of Black girls and women in adolescent research. How do research paradigms or the researcher's epistemology inform the study of Black girls and women in adolescent research? And third, and finally, what methodologies used by researchers in studying Black girls and women in adolescent are used, by researchers in studying Black girls and women in adolescent development research? What methodologies are used? Okay, so that is what I'll summarize from the introduction. Moving on to the method, a few different things that I want to note. First, we conducted an extremely comprehensive literature search of to be redundant, of the literature, specifically in 4 high circulated adolescent development journals starting in 2010. So what this means is that we kind of focused our search on the 4 adolescent development journals that, because they were highly circulated, they are often seen as 4 of the most prestigious journals in the field. And therefore, and again, kind of directly connecting back to the fact that they're highly circulated, these are the 4 journals that a lot of people consume when trying to learn about adolescent development research. And we started this search in 2010 and went through to 2019, I believe. We used what was referred to the PRISMA method, which is something I'll return to a little bit later in the recording. But here you can see the flow chart of where we started, and particularly wanting to point out that we started with 720 records after the screening and kind of the duplicate removal. And we screened 720 abstracts. We ended up including 48 articles in our analysis. And here is a table that really shows the highly comprehensive nature of the search. So these are all of the keywords that we used to actually conduct this literature search. In terms of inclusion criteria, it's also very important that a systematic review identifies different criteria for inclusion within that systematic review. So when we're conducting our literature search, in other words, how did we get all the way from 720 down to 48? How did we decide that those 48 articles would be the ones that would be included within our systematic review? We compared them to our inclusion criteria. And we, in this systematic review, had 4 criteria for inclusion in particular. First, the studies had to include girls and or women who identified as being Black or African American. 2, the sample needed to be somewhere between the ages of 10 and 25, which reflects the adolescent developmental period along with emerging adulthood. Third, the study had to be published between 2010 and 2020, given that it was those 10 years that we were interested in casting a spotlight on. And fourth, the study had to be conducted within the United States. So based on this inclusion criteria, as I mentioned, we screened 720 articles or abstracts of those articles. And this can take a lot of time. We actually did this. Definitely ask the authors, including me, if you would like kind of more about this trajectory, but we actually did this, I think, relatively quickly. Anyway, I'm kind of getting sidetracked now and remembering the different process of putting this, of publishing this article. But all of that is to say that screening 720 abstracts and comparing them to your inclusion criteria is definitely a very worthwhile task, and one that certainly can take a lot of time. Then we engaged in what's called a coding process. Coding is something that often occurs, if not always, within the systematic review process, where the authors are systematically retrieving key information from all of the included articles that helps us in some way either gather descriptive information about each of the studies and or importantly, helps us to address at least one of our research questions. So finally, we engaged in the coding process. In terms of the results and discussion, there are five major themes that emerged from the findings that I would like to highlight within this recording. First is the dearth of critical theoretical frameworks that were reflected within the literature that we found. In other words, there were very few articles that adopted a critical epistemological perspective rather than, for example, a positivist one. There was also a pretty significant, or actually more than a pretty significant, a very significant lack of acknowledgement of the intersectional experiences of Black girls and women. So, in other words, I don't think I'm going to do the kind of definition of intersectionality justice, but there was a lack of acknowledgement of the fact that Black girls and women, all of us, have a number of different social identities that intersect in a really meaningful and a really nuanced way. I highly encourage you to ask our scholars that are co-authors on this article, Dr. Rihanna Roby and Dr. Corey Nicolai, more about intersectionality if you were interested, because they both have a lot of really impressive expertise on this phenomenon and on this literature. So definitely I encourage you to follow up with them about that if you're interested. But getting back to the five major themes, the third major theme that we highlighted is that there was really kind of a lot of variation in the ways that researchers incorporated racial and or ethnic information into their study. And third, sadly, there was a lot of evidence that we gathered to kind of uncover the theme that there was a pretty kind of common deficit rather than asset-based perspective that was adopted within this literature. And then finally, one of the most significant themes and findings that emerged from this work was the extreme kind of dominance of quantitative designs within the literature that we found. I think something like 85% of the articles that were included in the systematic review all ended up adopting a quantitative rather than a qualitative methodology. And we can talk, if you would like, in the discussion with Doctors Roby and Nicolai about the implications of our methodological choices for the kinds of conclusions and that we're able to draw, and importantly, the kinds of voices that we're able to really center and amplify in the research process. So another thing that I want to highlight in this recording is that these five major themes and the systematic review more broadly really served as a powerful impetus for future work to include, first of all, more appropriate theoretical frameworks and methodologies that are better positioned to consider sociocultural influences and treating race as more as a means for comparisons. There were also two concrete recommendations that we highlighted in the discussion for future work, and specifically for incorporating critical approaches into adolescent research. First, we recommended that scholars seriously consider being very intentional with using very precise and inclusive language, as well as honoring intersectional or intersecting identities and critical theories. So that was one kind of major recommendation that we proposed within the discussion. And then second, we recommended that researchers really focus on prioritizing, broadening their methodological approaches. So now I'm going to conclude this recording as I usually do, not today with a question to grapple with, since our discussion later this week is going to be a little bit shorter than usual. But instead, I want to really focus on some key features and takeaways that I'd like you to pay attention to from the article. And I'm going to start from a substantive perspective. One thing that I really want to highlight is that something major that we can conclude from this work is that when it comes to the experiences of Black girls and women, and importantly, when it comes to what has been published in top adolescent development journals in the field, we really don't know a whole lot about the experiences of Black girls and women. There's a lot of information that simply has not yet been, or a lot of questions that have simply not yet been interrogated within the literature. And importantly, there is a lot of information based on the way that the research that was conducted that risks um, mis misrepresenting at best the experiences of Black girls and women. So that's really one of the first things that I want to emphasize from a substantive perspective, that there's a lot that we really don't know about this population of youth. Second, awareness of our field's omissions that are both historical in nature and also very much bleeding into more contemporary work, as we saw, given the systematic review spanned a relatively recent time period. Awareness of not only our field's assets, but also of its major omissions is really important to make sure that we, as scholars who kind of at slightly different trajectories, but all of us, something that all of us have in common is that we're relatively early in our careers. And being aware of not only the assets of our field, but also its major omissions allows us to be really intentional about not repeating those same omissions in our own work, taking steps to making sure that we don't repeat those same omissions in our own work. Another thing that I want to highlight is that key constructs like race, ethnicity, gender, for example, even making a distinction between an asset-based or a deficit-based perspective, those kinds of terms and constructs are often not defined in the developmental and also in the educational psychology literature. I think that this article, in the way that we really kind of provided elaborated definitions, I think that this article serves as a really powerful counterexample in that way. Um, Another thing that I want to point out is that if any of you, which I think that some of you are based on the conversations that we've had with all of you about your capstones and just about your research interests more broadly, if any of you are interested in racial and ethnic identity, gender identity, and especially as those constructs, importantly, are connected to Black girls and women in particular, this article, I think, given its systematic nature and given kind of its sort of clear communication of what we know and what we really don't know, I think that this article will serve as an excellent resource and also starting point for your own reading that you might do kind of on these constructs and on this particular topic, if that is an interest area of yours. A final thing that I want to comment on from a substantive perspective is you may have noticed throughout the article that when we referred to white as a race, as a racial identity, we did not capitalize it. And we provided an endnote at the end of the paper, an endnote at the end of the paper. That was super redundant on my part. But anyway, we provided an endnote that explained why we made this decision. And the reason why I want to point this out is before getting to work with this incredible group of scholars on this paper, that was something, the kind of decision to capitalize white when referring to it as a racial identity versus not, was not something that I had given nearly enough consideration. And so I just sort of wanted to bring that to everybody's attention as something for you all to consider, or just to be really intentional about in your own writing. And I encourage you to take a look. I won't repeat that footnote or that endnote since I'm trying to keep this recording relatively brief, but I do encourage you to go and take a look back at it and to potentially ask our guest scholars about their thoughts about these kind of decisions that may seem trivial, but are actually really important and communicate a lot to readers. So that's it from a substantive perspective. From a methodological perspective, just a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, I want to again cast a spotlight on a systematic review in general and how powerful of a tool it can be for generating a lot of knowledge. So we've read at least one systematic review so far in this course. This is, I believe, our second one now. And I wanted to take a second to elaborate. I know that Danny did an excellent job in the last recording talking about systematic reviews and their assets. And I want to repeat a lot of the things that she said to reinforce them. And then also to add a couple of additional thoughts on my own, kind of from my own perspective. That a systematic review, again, to kind of formally define it, it's a specific type of literature review where the goal is to conduct a comprehensive synthesis, a comprehensive and importantly, a systematic synthesis of a given body of literature. And it can be a really powerful methodological strategy to use for at least two different reasons. One, it provides us with a synthesis of the current state of the field, which allows us to understand what do we know? What do we know about a given kind of set of research questions? What do we already know based on the current state of the literature? It also allows us to systematically identify gaps within the literature to kind of identify the or answer the question of not only what do we know, but what do we not know? And I think that this systematic review and the Fife et al. Systematic review that we read a few weeks ago provides a really good example of both of those questions. What do we know? Here's all of this stuff that we know, stuff to use a super precise word, but also what do we not know? What gaps characterize the literature? And I also wanted to point out in terms of opportunities, in a lot of different ways, as I know that Danny mentioned in her recording as well, this can be an especially valuable methodological strategy for grad students and early career scholars. Specifically, in terms of the benefits, it can be really valuable anytime in your career, but perhaps especially as a grad student or an ECR, to get to know a whole body of literature really, 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 really well. If any of you, and I know that there are some of you who have conducted a systematic review before, are listening, I suspect you'll agree with that statement that by the time you have finished conducting a systematic review of the literature, there is probably nobody in this entire world who knows that literature better than you do. So that can be a real benefit. Another benefit of conducting a systematic review is just pragmatically, you don't need access to primary empirical data. And I think that that can be particularly valuable or particularly beneficial for early career scholars and for grad students who don't necessarily have their own opportunities yet to collect data or to collect data in a way that allows them to sort of reach their goals by with a specific time frame in mind. Another sort of just logistical benefit that I think is especially valuable for grad students and ECRs is that grant funding, I will say, helps a lot with conducting a systematic review efficiently and conducting it well. But a systematic review can absolutely be done without grant funding, I would argue, especially if it's a systematic review that's a little bit smaller in size, or in other words, includes fewer rather than a really large number of studies. And the last kind of more extrinsic benefit that I wanted to highlight that comes along with conducting and then publishing a systematic review is, importantly, systematic reviews get cited a lot. And especially as we advance in our careers, not only publishing one's work, but then making sure that it gets cited a lot can be really valuable, again, for many intrinsic reasons, but also for many extrinsic reasons that are related to merit and promotion as you advance in your career. So those are just a few benefits that I wanted to highlight about why why are systematic reviews so valuable and why might they be particularly valuable to consider for grad students and ECRs. However, notice I said here on the slide, opportunities and obstacles. There are a lot of obstacles and a lot of caveats associated with conducting a systematic review as well. And I would say that the primary shortcoming, especially thinking about graduate students and ECRs, is that conducting a systematic review can be really, really, really overwhelming. And ironically, I would argue that it's critically important to have a pretty good, if not extremely thorough understanding of the literature that you're synthesizing before you conduct the systematic review. Many grad students, just because they're are only so many years that grad students have spent kind of situated within the literature, many grad students don't necessarily have that understanding of the literature yet. Many more advanced scholars also don't necessarily have that really kind of thorough understanding of the literature. So what that means is I would not say don't conduct a systematic review if you don't have a good handle on the literature yet, but I would strongly suggest making sure that you include at least one co-author who has that really kind of foundational understanding. And that'll make the systematic review process go a lot more smoothly. Um, Danny and I have a lot of experience conducting systematic reviews of our own. As I mentioned recently, Danny actually just had a first author article published, which was a systematic review. So all of that is to say that if you are interested in conducting one, don't hesitate to let us know, and we'd be very happy to share more resources with you. The last thing that I want to mention is, from a methodological perspective, is really to cast a spotlight on this Prisma approach to conducting the systematic review, and then also the coding methodology. So, if you do conduct a systematic review, uh, Prisma is the way that the literature search, in particular, was conducted. And it recommends sort of a very systematic, very comprehensive approach. Um, the reason why I wanted to cast a spotlight on it here is that it is sort of a growing expectation that if you're going to conduct a systematic review, that you use this Prisma approach. So that's why I really wanted to kind of bring it to everybody's attention. The coding methodology as well. Let's see. I don't think, yeah, I didn't include, I didn't paste it into the slide. I think it was too challenging to paste. But in terms of the coding methodology, I highly recommend that you take a look back at the table that summarizes our coding protocol. Of course, I'm a little bit biased because I was a co-author on this article, and therefore I kind of contributed to this process myself. But I think that the coding protocol and the way that we summarized it in the article can serve as a really good example of what is expected, what level of detail and what level of systematicity is expected when engaging in a coding process for the purpose of conducting a systematic review. Okay, just a couple, or actually, I think just one final comment, sort of from a writing perspective. Given that I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to serve as a co-author on this paper. Um, the substantive focus of this paper is of significant interest to me. And is I am very, very interested in continuing to build my expertise in this area, but I am by no means an expert on critical epistemological approaches, on the lived experiences of Black girls and women. That is beyond my area of expertise. The reason why I was brought on to this paper was because of my expertise primarily in systematic review, along with my knowledge of the developmental psychology literature. The reason why I wanted to point that out was, again, it's always really interesting, I think, to hear a little bit about like the stories that are associated with publishing an article, but also to reinforce the point that quite often, if not always, when you are invited onto a paper to serve as a co-author, and even when you invite yourself as the lead author, I guess, to conduct some work, like to conduct a given study, it's a really, really valuable opportunity to learn things, not only to contribute your own knowledge, but 100% of the time, and I don't say this often, it's also, meaning not very rarely is anything ever kind of 100%, but it's also a really, really valuable opportunity to learn really kind of valuable skills and literatures and whatever else from your co-authors. And that was definitely my experience, perhaps especially so in this publication. So I wanted to highlight that from a writing perspective, that when you are contributing to a paper, you're not only contributing your own knowledge, it's also a really valuable learning opportunity to learn deeply from your colleagues. And that was certainly the case for me with this article. So I'm going to conclude the recording there. As always, thank you so much for listening. Really, really looking forward to our discussion with particularly with our guest scholars, Doctors Roby and Nikolai, on later this week. So thanks again, and we will chat more about this article then.